In this video, let's try to implement authentication provider and do authentication of the user as per our business requirements. For that, let's try to check what we have done previously. So previously we have an implementation of user detail service, and from my default authentication provider, which is DAO authentication provider, a call will happen to load user by user name, and this will go to the database and leverage my password encoders and check everything. Once authentication is successful, user details will be sent back to my provider where the conversion from user details to authentication is happening, which we saw in the previous video. So now I don't want to follow this user detail service, and I don't want to tightly couple with this Spring security mechanism of user detail service and user details. I just wanted to have my own implementation, ignoring this default provided interfaces, user contract, everything. So for that, we just have to create a class which implements authentication provider and annotate that class with @component. So inside this, we have to override a method called authenticate, which accepts authentication and returns the authentication. So here I'm just taking the username from the authentication object by taking get name, which is from the principal interface, and passwords also I am taking from the get credentials. So now what I'm doing is I'm just directly calling my repository with the username, and once I get the customer details, I'm leveraging the password encoder to just check whether the match between what I received and what I stored in the database in terms of hash is matching. If everything is matching, then I'm just trying to populate the authorities based upon the role that I have in my customer object and forming a username password authentication token. So if you remember in our previous videos, we have discussed this. This is an implementation of authentication interface itself. So when I form this object of this class and return to the method authenticate, framework will happily accept that and will not throw any issues. So here at the same time we also have supports method which I have to implement, and here I'm saying to framework whenever I get input which of type username password authentication token from the user, then only use this provider. But if you have a scenario where I am receiving some fingerprint or OTP, then I don't want to use this provider. So in such scenarios, we can create any number of providers with the same approach, but the only difference will be the supports method will have different authentication implementation along with this type. So maybe in such scenarios, we have to write our own authentication implementation with the name like fingerprint authentication token dot class. So once we have done that, then any number of authentication provider we can configure, and automatically our Spring security detects, since we are annotating this with component and implementing authentication provider, our Spring security is smart enough to detect all these providers. And as I was saying previously, we can have any number of providers implemented inside our Spring security, and our provider manager, which implements the authentication manager, will take the responsibility of calling each and every authentication provider till either we get bad credentials or till we get a successful authentication, or all the providers has been tried but still there is no authentication happening. So now I just keep a breakpoint here also, and I'm also keeping a breakpoint here to show you that my code will not stop here because I'm not going to use the user detail service, all those things. My code will directly call from my provider manager to this provider will call with the authentication parameter. Here I just wanted to show you I'm not following any user details or user detail service, and even I can ignore this password encoder also. I can have my own implementation. I'm just showing this code so that we can have a mix of all the things also. Like in this scenario, I'm just leveraging password encoder, but not leveraging any user details or user detail service. It's up to us to write inside this method whatever we want, but at the end of the authentication happens, we have to return a object of type authentication. So now let's try to go to a browser and call my account service with the credentials. So credentials are happy at the rate example.com. Password is 12345. So now you can see, as I was saying, the filters will intercept my request and they will call the authentication manager. So in this scenario, provider manager is the implementation of authentication manager. So they will call provider manager dot authenticate, and this will internally call authenticate method. Here you can see it is inside for loop, and let's try to see what all providers available. There is only one provider available which is of type EasyBank username password authentication provider, which we have implemented. But if you have implemented 3 or 4, all of them will be shown here, and the provider manager will make sure it is covering all the providers till it reaches either successful authentication or invalid authentication. So in this scenario, since my to test is of data type username password authentication token, which is supported by my provider EasyBank username PWD authentication provider, it is allowing to pass further. And once I release this breakpoint, this will call my authenticate implementation method, and here you can see all the code will be executed successfully and you will get a response whatever we have mentioned in the backend. This is how we should implement authentication provider and override a method of authenticate as per our requirements. So we have seen all the details about authentication provider, how to create them, and how authentication manager implementations like provider manager will call all the providers that we have defined one by one, and how the authentication happens by Spring Security as per our logic written inside the authenticate method. I hope this is making sense to you, and I'll also attach this code to this video. Please download it and do hands-on, and if you have any questions, please post in the Q&A section. Thank you, and I will see you in the next section. Bye.